Good afternoon. Welcome to the Closing the Racial Wealth Gap and Building an Inclusive Economy conversation. My name is Curtis Dubé, Senior Economist here at the Chamber. As Jenna just showed, racial disparities in wealth have long been a troubling issue. Frustratingly, it's one that has eluded our efforts to fix it for a long time. It's going to take years to close the gap, perhaps generations, so we don't have any time to lose. We have with us today three distinguished economists that will help us think through new ideas about how to build wealth in minority communities. Dr. Ira Kalish joins us from Deloitte, where he is the chief global economist. He is a specialist in global economic issues, as well as the effects of economic, demographic, and social trends on the global business environment. Dr. Valerie Ralston-Wilson is director, Program on Race, Ethnicity, and the Economy, PRE, at the Economic Policy Institute. PRE is a nationally recognized source for expert reports and policy analyses on the economic condition of America's people of color. And our last speaker today is Anna Hernandez-Kent. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for Economic Equity at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. She conducts research, performs data analysis, and advises on issues of economic equity. At the end of our discussion, we will take a few questions from the audience. Please put your questions in the chat and I will read them to our speakers. With that, let's begin our discussion. Ira, start us off with this question, the one that really gets to the root of the problem, or the root of the issue. What are the potential solutions to the persistent problem of racial wealth inequality? And what is the business community's role in that effort?
Okay, thank you, Curtis, and good day, everybody. So as an economist, I'm usually expected to talk about data points and policies, interest rates, monetary policy, and so on. But today, what I'd like to talk about is human behavior. And that may sound odd, but actually at its root, economics is about human behavior and about incentives and about whether people act rationally or irrationally and what the consequences of that are. And in our society, millions of people make decisions, often irrational, that are discriminatory in nature, which have the effect of reducing opportunities for Black Americans. The wealth disparity and the income disparity stems in part from an inability of people to get capital, to buy a home, to get capital for entrepreneurship, to get jobs that enable them to have sufficient income to save. And those disparities come from the decisions of millions of people, decisions made by people in financial institutions, at retail stores, in human resource offices of employers, and of course in law enforcement. And if you were to approach any of the people that make discriminatory decisions, they would probably tell you, no, I'm not racist at all. Quite the contrary. And they'd be very sincere in saying that, but the reality is that people make decisions that have a discriminatory effect. And so what do we do about that? There are essentially two things that we can do and that will take a long time to resolve. One, of course, is just simply greater enforcement of existing laws against discriminatory behavior, especially in the realm of financial services, but also in the realm of employment. But that's difficult. These are difficult things to enforce. It's difficult to impose penalties for discriminatory behavior. I think at the larger level, it's a matter of changing the attitudes of people in society. And I think business has a major role to play in that, because many businesses, my own included, often provide training to people about these issues. And in fact, as an employee of Deloitte, I've actually seen and had to take online classes that discuss these issues. And often I think people are surprised when they see what actually takes place in our society, how people of color are treated differently in a wide range of areas, often in small ways, what we call microaggressions, but in the aggregate adding up to a very substantial impact. And I think that it's incumbent on us in the business community to require training of our people, millions of people who are employed by us, to better understand what actually happens so that they can think differently about how they behave themselves. I think really in the long run, that's the only way we're going to get past this, in that it's really an issue of human behavior and human attitude, often irrational and often under the radar screen, in the sense people don't even realize what they're doing.
Thank you. Valerie, Anna, why don't you jump in on the same question?
So I think the point that Ira made about decisions is an important one, because businesses make decisions all the time that have implications for racial wealth inequality. Obviously, banks have the most direct impact because they make decisions that control the flow of capital. But other businesses make decisions that have an impact here as well. We think about decisions about where businesses locate. Has implications for employment and broader economic development in the communities where they're located, as well as decisions about who they do business with, supply chain decisions that can have major implications for the health and well-being of minority-owned businesses.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, speaking for myself and not necessarily the Federal Reserve, that we know the racial wealth gap was created by systems and policies of exclusion. So any solutions that we consider need to be around not just inclusion, but also targeted inclusion. So in that sense, there are many different ideas that have been put forth. Some related to education that I think are worth mentioning today include just valuing education as a society more. So we can do more to publicly support public institutions, as well as rethink how we fund K through 12 education. A lot of that is through, say, local taxes, which is just unheard of in other developing countries. And so if we rethink that, I think that we can really make the pathways to education and better careers, better jobs available to people more widely. And businesses' role in that is A, to support those efforts, and B, to also support their minority workers who want to go back, get higher education or upskill. And they can do that both financially as well as culturally by giving their employees time off if they need to go to class during the day, and perhaps making up their work time during non-traditional work hours.
That's all really interesting. And please feel free to talk back and respond to each other. But I think that's a really good segue to our second question, which is what can businesses do from the employment side of things to help people of color build wealth? Valerie, please, why don't you kick that one off?
So I alluded to this a bit before, but the role of businesses as employers is absolutely critical. The vast majority of income in non-elderly households in this country comes from work. It's labor income. And while income is not wealth, inadequate income is a barrier to wealth building. And there are large and persistent racial disparities in employment and pay that are actually defining features of the US labor market, and as a result, major contributors to the income gap, and by extension, the wealth gap. For example, Black workers are typically twice as likely to be unemployed as white workers, even at historically low rates of unemployment like we saw in 2019. This was the case overall, but it was also the case at nearly every level of education. And that's an important point to make, because it identifies the fact that the unemployment gap is not simply a skills gap, that there's something else going on there. Among those who are employed, Black workers also face significant pay disparities relative to white workers. And in fact, less than half of the observed Black-white difference in average hourly wage is explained by factors presumed to be associated with individual productivity, such as education or experience. And so similarly, pay gaps are not simply skills gaps. Pay disparities reflect racial differences in the types of jobs that workers hold. This is something that we call occupational segregation. It's characterized by overrepresentation of Black workers in lower wage jobs and underrepresentation in higher wage occupations. There are also racial differences in access to opportunities for promotion, which are essentially opportunities for sizable pay raises. And then there's the issue of just outright pay discrimination. Now, there are a number of things that businesses can do as employers. One, businesses can choose to implement and develop their own pay equity policies. That might include internal evaluation of employment and pay disparities in their workplace. It may include adopting pay transparency policies, or deciding not to ask about salary history in the hiring process. They can also take steps towards what I will call occupational desegregation. That would involve recruitment efforts that seek to get a diverse pool of applicants for all job openings at every level of pay. It also involves retention, policies focused on retention of workers of color, and greater transparency, again, and equity around opportunities for advancement. In addition to these things, which will have major implications for what I'm about to mention, that's access to benefits that are important to wealth building. They can make important workplace benefits more widely and equitably available to all workers. That includes retirement benefits, which is directly a means of building wealth, in addition to the broader access to things like health insurance and paid sick and parental leave.
Really interesting. Anna, why don't you weigh in on this as well?
Yeah, and I agree with much of what Valerie has been saying. And I think it's important to remember that many business practices are on the surface race neutral, but in practice, they're anything but. So for example, what Valerie was talking about with lower income and even contract workers, they don't get benefits much of the time. And that's something that is squarely within the control of businesses and employers that they can change. They can provide paid medical leave, paid family leave. And we've seen how important those types of leave are in the past year and a half with improving things like labor force participation rates and retention rates, et cetera. So I think these are really important, small, kind of minor changes that require a shift in mentality for a lot of companies, but that's something that they can be doing now. They can also be providing shared profits. They can provide stock options for all of their workers. They can provide matching 401k contributions if they're not doing so already, and opt-out policies for retirement savings accounts as opposed to opt-in to help equalize those uptake rates between different races and ethnicities. As Valerie mentioned in the previous question, they can also take a more critical look at the types of services that they're asking for and retaining, and look at Black-owned businesses first in order to really narrow the racial wealth gap in that sense. And finally, as Valerie also mentioned, they can look at their own workforce. They can look at making sure that there is support for minority workers from entry level to managerial level and executive levels as well. And one important thing I want to mention, because diversity and inclusion efforts have been so elevated recently, we need to make sure that we're not placing undue burden on our minority workers to take up that unpaid extra work, and making sure that if they are put in positions of leadership, that comes with associated power and advancement opportunities as well.
Thank you for that. Ira, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that a large share of employment in this country is through very small businesses, and a disproportionate share of employment growth are small businesses and entrepreneurial businesses. And I think a very important way to build job opportunities and wealth for Black Americans would be through promoting more entrepreneurship in the Black community. I think it's notable if you look at Asian and Hispanic immigrants who have been relatively entrepreneurial and have relied often on networks within their own ethnic groups to raise capital. This hasn't happened to the same degree in the Black community, and that's for historic reasons. But I think this goes right back to problems in discriminatory behavior by financial institutions. There's a much greater need for entrepreneurship in the Black community to create Black-owned businesses that will in turn generate more employment in the Black community, especially on a location basis. So I think that may be an area where if we're successful in generating more entrepreneurship, it could have a very significant effect on employment and wealth creation.
Great. So I think we have only a few minutes left, but I think it's a really good segue into our final question. And Anna, lead us off with this one. And it is, what actionable items could help to build wealth in disadvantaged communities? And as a follow-up, I'm curious, is what has gotten better in this regard in the last year, if anything? So Anna, please.
So in the past year and a half or so, it's become abundantly clear, if it wasn't before, that we do not have racial economic equity in this country. That being said, there has been some progress made and a lot of support behind many promising ideas. For example, more affordable childcare, child development accounts, 529 accounts, which focus on education, can be universal, meaning for all, and progressive, meaning that children of less wealthy parents receive more seed money. And this is really important because it allows children, minority children, other children, all children to start out with some money. And that changes not only financial and educational outcomes, but psychological ones as well. Relatedly, a colleague of mine, Ray Bashara, has a similar idea, but for retirement, 401 kids. Similarly, it's started at birth and it can be funded and make a great impact on our future generations. And I think it's really important to remember that we're leaving, right now, we are leaving a lot of untapped potential, skills, ideas, knowledge, resources on the table. And it's ultimately not a zero-sum game. So we need to continue the momentum, continue these conversations to produce actionable results, because ultimately, if we do, we'll be producing a more prosperous economy for everyone.
Thanks. Ira.
Yeah, well, I agree with what Anna said, and I think what we did learn over the course of the past year was that people in lower incomes, especially women, especially in consumer-facing services, were the ones who were most vulnerable. They did get some government support, but I think some of the structural changes we're likely to see in the economy post-pandemic will mean the permanent loss of some jobs. And even as jobs return, what we're seeing is that people are struggling with the issue of childcare. And so I think some of the proposals that have been made, and of course we do have next month coming up the new $300 monthly benefit, which I think will be very beneficial. But I think also more subsidies for childcare will play a big role in enabling lower income people, especially women, to return to the workforce and be able to thrive. I think it's notable that the US alone, among major industrial economies, has seen an actual decline in female participation in the labor force over the past 2 decades. And the one thing that distinguishes the US from other industrial nations is the fact that we don't provide substantial support for childcare. So when you have low-income women, especially minority women, who face the choice of whether or not to go back to work and see the extraordinary cost of childcare, it's not a very easy choice to make. And I think that's an area where public policy can make a big difference in boosting labor force participation.
Valerie.
So I think the points that Anna and Ira made sort of hit both ends of the spectrum with regards to, what needs to happen to build wealth. We need asset building policies like those Anna mentioned, whether it be for child savings accounts or retirement savings accounts. But we also need to make sure that we're avoiding further loss of wealth as a result of things of extended periods of unemployment or a lack of childcare or lack of access to benefits that really fill the gap that having wealth would normally fill. So, since last summer, I don't know that I think a whole lot has changed, but there were a lot of promises being made and statements being made by organizations and businesses in this country. And I think there's great opportunity to make some changes, real lasting changes moving forward.
Ira, Valerie, Anna, thank you so much for your contributions today. It's been really, really interesting. Unfortunately, we have such a compressed time frame. We get some really great questions. It would have been really great to dig into that. Maybe we can do this in a more expanded format in the future. But thank you again for taking the time, and thank you to our audience, and thank you.